Hello and welcome to another episode of the Three View Mirror podcast, a podcast where we take a moment in time, an hour out of every week, and talk about the amazing pop culture things that happened back in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Gen X era stuff that we all know, or at least like to think back to and think we knew the way it was in better, simpler days. I'm joined with two co-hosts, and every week one of us will bring three different, seemingly random topics to the table that we discuss, and they and only they know that there is a hidden connection running through all of these topics that at the end of the hour, they will ask us if we figured out what their mystery connection is. See as you play along if you can figure it out before we figure it out. And today, the host bringing three topics to us is none other than Chris Clues.
What's up? I'm Chris Clues, better known as Chris Clues.
And I'm Rochelle O'Black, better known as Gen X Shell.
And I am John Catrides, also known as Gen X Jono, and this is the Three View Mirror podcast.
So you guys ready for today? Because I have three topics that I think and I hope that all of us know really, really well. It's the connection that I think is going to get all of you. And I'm convinced you're not going to get it.
All right, we'll wait and see.
Okay.
I'm up for the challenge.
All right. It's a fun connection. Okay, so my three are Don Johnson, Eddie Murphy, and my man, Patrick Swayze.
I know the connection.
I need a moment.
Me too. I know a connection already off the bat, so we'll see. We'll see how this goes.
Well, if you know it, that's pretty good. And even if you do, this is still going to be a fun journey.
I'm sure I don't know it. This is a Shell moment. This is a moment in time where you'll have me write it down at the end, and I'll have that Shell shitting and grin on my face, and then you can let me know that, no, I'm deadly wrong. We just published that episode in our time yesterday, and Shell, just watching you back in that moment when you're like, I got you, and you didn't.
You should write it down now then. So Shell, what do you think besides swooning a little?
I'm sweating. I have nothing as far as a connection goes because I'm blinded by the
Three alpha males, right?
Three alpha males with hunky. Oh, perfect.
Well, they're three of my favorites. And I'm excited to talk about all three of them today and the characters that they played. And again, as we talked about, like these kind of alpha male characters that had this really high energy. And of course, they could be funny, they could be snarky, they were in action movies. They ran the gamut. They were, without these three, it would be very difficult to say that we had a successful 80s pop culture decade.
So who are you starting with?
I'm going to start with Don Johnson. So we all know Don Johnson is what? Sonny Crockett? Did you just hear something?
Yeah, I was wondering what that was. I heard it too. It was like a clink. Oh, Shell.
You ever there? See, I was just about to forgot to mute that. Let me turn this off.
All right, just let me know when you're ready.
Yep.
Let's go back a minute. So who are we starting with, Chris?
We're going to start with Don Johnson. And Don Johnson, of the three, I mean, I would say they all three equally had huge influence on the 80s. But Don Johnson, as most of us know him as Sonny Crockett from the hit show Miami Vice, which I live in South Florida. And it's probably one of the reasons that I moved to South Florida was watching Miami Vice and wanting to be a part of everything that was down there. So when I say Don Johnson, what do both of you think of?
I think of the first and foremost, it's the clothes, Miami Vice. It's the pastels. It's that look that they curated that became part of pop culture. We see it played out for years after. I mean, even Friends episodes, when they used to do the throwback episodes with Chandler and Ross going into the 80s when they were in college, they're wearing the Miami Vice clothes. And then the second thing, and probably more prevalent for me, I never wore the clothes, but I did steal the look of the scruff. And I remember Sonny Crockett, like that character, perennially had the same level of stubble on his face no matter what. He was never bearded and he was never clean shaven. And for Christmas, I got an electric razor that actually had a setting back in like 1989 that was like a stubble setting that it would only shave close enough that you maintained that perfect Miami Vice look. And I had one of those.
The Don Johnson shaver. I'd like to blame Don Johnson for having a really stinky experience in high school, because I blame him for the penny loafers without socks look. And, penny loafers when they were genuinely, and they might still be, but, all the shoes were made of leather. And then somebody with their stinky feet would stick their feet right underneath the back of your chair. And that's all the smell you got wafting up. And that is Don Johnson's fault. I'm convinced.
It was the loafers, but it was also the wicker shoes. Like they had like those wicker shoes, and I think that's how Chandler lost a toe, because those shoes provide no protection, and a knife went right through his little toe.
Harachis, am I saying? Do I got that right?
I think so. Yeah.
Harachis, yeah, Harachis were a big deal. That was the other thing, with kind of half-flooded pants, and you definitely didn't wear socks.
He actually got a little bit of flack because he met President Reagan and he wasn't wearing socks. It was a real thing. And he actually said, I live in Miami. Why would I wear socks? So, and I can vouch for that.
Well, not only that, but I think he also got flack for like not shaving. So I'm sure part of that conversation was you met the president and you weren't clean shaven, because that was still kind of it was a different thing back then. Today, you go into a bank and you'll see the bank branch manager could have stubble on his face, 2-day growth, 3-day growth. Not a big deal. Back in the 70s and 80s, yeah, no, that wasn't professionally appropriate. You couldn't do that. Women had to wear stockings if their legs were showing. Men had to be clean shaven. There were rules that don't apply today.
And your mustache or beard had to be very well tended to if you decided to maintain one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was just the women.
I see my chin stubble from here.
John was talking about doing the stubble. I couldn't grow anything. I tried to grow a mustache, and I would have had to be 500 feet from an elementary school. I had this I looked like I drove an ice cream truck.
I did not get that right away. That was a very un-Chris Clues-like comment.
It was a bad little mustache.
We called that a dirt stash. It just looked like your like dirty upper lip. Now,
I will say, did you know that he actually has... Okay, so we talk about David Hasselhoff and how he's like, this hero rock star in Germany. There is a Finnish band that's named the Don Johnson Big Band. And they're all about Don Johnson. All their videos, everything.
Really?
I had no idea.
Yeah. I love that he prefaced that by "did you know?" Like there's a world that exists that we would just know that. But with the three of us, you never know. I will say that when I think of your other two choices, they came onto the scene, they did what made them big names, and then they just exploded from there. Don Johnson feels a little different to me because he was huge as Sonny Crockett, made a couple movies, did branch out a little bit, but I don't know if it was typecasting. I don't know if we only wanted to see him in a certain place. Doesn't seem like he was able to move beyond that for me. Maybe it was just me, but he stands out in that he got really big doing what we knew him for, and that's kind of where he stayed.
Well, back at that time too, he always reminded me of Kevin Costner. And Kevin Costner, he always reminded me of Kevin Costner. And, they had that same somewhat look, attitude, even just something about them. And, Kevin Costner was big at that time. So maybe they just didn't need two people that were somewhat similar. Chris, am I crazy to think that they were somewhat similar?
You're not at all. In fact, Don Johnson did audition for Elliot Ness in The Untouchables that went to Kevin Costner. They also ended up in Tin Cup together, which is one of my favorite movies. So no, you're not wrong in thinking that. I think a lot of the casting directors back in the day probably felt that they were similar, but he had gotten typecast a little bit as Sonny Crockett.
John, you looked at me very strangely when I said he always reminded me of him. That
doesn't resonate with me. They're very different. Kevin Costner was more everyman, good-looking guy, but I think what resonated with him with me is he was somebody I could see myself just hanging out with. Have a beer with, go catch a game with, whereas Don Johnson was more of that pretty boy that, was just, the Hollywood personification of the pinup guy. I don't know. It just seemed more of that sort of thing to it. That's all.
And they're both pretty good athletes, which is probably why they found themselves in some similar places, because there are a lot of actors that play athletes that aren't necessarily athletic. Those guys happen to be. And so that may be, again, they're both in Tin Cup. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing it out there. I didn't really research that part of it. But one thing I found interesting was that he starred, this is crazy, and I wonder if this movie is going to come back this year. He starred in a post-apocalyptic film called A Boy and His Dog. And it was in 1975. And guess what year that post-apocalyptic film was actually set in?
2024.
2024.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? I wonder if it's going to resurface this year. It should, right? And can you believe this one? Actually, the person that they were looking the closest at until Don Johnson came along for Sonny Crockett was Larry Wilcox, who was one of the two Chips. Now, what's cool about that is that when they asked Larry Wilcox about it years later, he actually said that, he didn't get the role, and he was all but signed the paperwork. And he was obviously a little upset about not getting the role, but he said, honestly, looking back, Don Johnson was the perfect Sonny Crockett. So
he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of someone you could never imagine his replacement in that show, he was the show.
And we talk about soundtracks with movies. I always talk about that. But the soundtrack for Miami Vice was pretty awesome as well. There were a lot of songs that were in Miami Vice, like Glenn Frey's Smuggler's Blues, the theme song itself by Jan Hammer. I think it was Jan Hammer. Jan Hammer, the Miami Vice theme song. And then there were several other songs in that soundtrack, in the Miami Vice soundtrack, that I actually had the CD. There were a lot of songs and bands that played in the Miami Vice soundtrack as well.
And as soon as that song tunes up, you unmistakably know that is Miami Vice.
Absolutely. And it was actually not a bad movie either. The Miami Vice movie wasn't a bad movie either, by the way.
I don't even remember there being a Miami Vice movie.
Mm-hmm.
I was just about to say the same thing, but then I'm a girl that maybe didn't watch Miami Vice the same amount or with the same fervor as you guys did. And I had no idea that there was a movie.
Yeah, there was a movie. It was, I want to say it was Colin Farrell, maybe, that was in the movie. So Smuggler's Blues, I mentioned. Own the Night by Shaka Khan. You Belong to the City. In the Air Tonight, Phil Collins. Of course, the theme song, Tina Turner, Better Be Good to Me. So a lot of really cool artists and songs on the Miami Vice soundtrack, which
I seem to remember, and I can get fact checked in the comments here, but at least at the time, if not still through to today, In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins, at the time, at the very least, was the only time that a song played on a television program from beginning to end uninterrupted. And they just had that song on as they drove down the street. And it literally, I think, played the entire song all the way through, no dialogue, no interruption, and it was just a moment.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually.
What year did it start, Chris? What year was Miami Vice? What was the range of years?
84 to 89.
So he was married to Melanie Griffith, if I remember correctly.
I think so, at least dating. Were they married,
Yeah.
Chris?
I think at least dating as well. I don't want to go out on a limb and say they were married, but they definitely had a daughter, right? Right, Shell?
They had, yes, Dakota Johnson.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar. Did she act as well?
Well, yeah, she was actually the star in 50 Shades of Grey, which was a very popular book. Speaking of going like this, very popular book among women. And let me tell you something.
And for those that aren't watching this podcast on YouTube and they're only listening, Rochelle was only fanning her face. When she said the movie made you go like this, get your minds out of the gutter. She was just fanning her face.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and she was in a few others as well. Off the top of my head, I can't recall, but I think, yeah, for sure. She's been doing some acting.
The only other thing that can be said of Don Johnson is he had a one-hit wonder. He had a hit song in the 80s. I just don't remember the name of the song, but he had this god-awful song that made its way onto the charts. And I don't remember
Heartbeat.
it. It was
Heartbeat.
Heartbeat.
Yeah.
Yep. And it did. I don't think they played it on Miami Vice. I don't think it was something that lasted long on the charts, but it got onto the charts. And, you can make the same joke about so many 80s actors, including Eddie Murphy and Patrick Swayze. They shared time on Billboard charts as singers as well as actors.
He did a duet, I think, with Barbra Streisand as well.
Wow.
I'm pretty sure. Again, fact check out there. I'm not going to go Google it right now, but I think he did. Let's talk a little Eddie Murphy. When I say Eddie Murphy, though,
what I can do, and anticipating Chris's question of when I say Eddie Murphy, what do you think of? It's you don't got no ice cream. Your dad's on welfare. You can't afford it. Wanna lick? Psych.
You dropped your ice cream. You dropped your ice cream.
Soundtrack of my life. I mean, watching that when I shouldn't have been watching it, but it stuck with us. And we psyched our way all through school the next day after watching it. That word entered our lexicon. Kids still say it today. I think they invented it. And when we were kids, it was, PSYCH. Now it's SIKE, but it's the same thing. And nobody did it better than Eddie.
His red leather suit, his red leather, like how he wasn't dripping sweat up there with all the zippers, sort of Michael Jackson-ish looking up there was, his stand-up is iconic. Him, George Carlin, Richard Pryor, absolutely iconic.
Iconic. And the things he made fun of. And then he replicated the red leather with the purple leather, Delirious and Raw back to back, and making fun of the fact that Bill Cosby, of all people, called to shame him between those two acts, because I think it was Delirious that was first, and he took a call from Bill Cosby saying, "You swear too much in your act. Yeah, go drug another person." But the point is to have Bill Cosby shaming him, and then he gets on his next comedy tour and makes fun of Bill Cosby for doing it. It was iconic. It was awesome.
Yeah, he, obviously the stand-up, and he started stand-up when he was 15 years old. So it was early on. And I always think of the beginning of, I'm going to get this wrong. I think it was the beginning of Raw.
It was.
Where it shows him with his family. And I'm pretty sure Samuel Jackson is in that. In the living room with the family. I got to double check that. But when he says, and he kicked him in the ding ding. Like, that was something that we always said so much. Repeated that joke about the lion and the elephant, and he kicked him in the ding ding. And I again, like, thinking about the influences in my life growing up in my teens, and Eddie Murphy was a huge influence on me and on a lot of us. I think the comedy that he did was, we would say it's irreverent, but he made fun of everybody. Like, that was what was great about his comedy. When you look at like a Robin Williams and a George Carlin or Richard Pryor, it was everyone. Everybody was fair game, and they made sure that, including themselves, by the way, even more so than anybody else, they would make fun of themselves. And I think that's what made their comedy great. And then, of course, he went on to do all these movies that had a huge influence. With Beverly Hills Cop, he was the first actor who made their debut. So he made his debut in 48 Hours, his official like feature film debut. He was the first actor to ever get $1 million for his debut.
Wow.
That's how much they believed in him.
Doesn't surprise me. Huge name. I mean, not ready for primetime players. He followed up on SNL during that genre. He came right after them, and I remember the characters that he created on SNL. Buckwheat. Talk about making fun of himself, making fun of the stereotypes about his own culture. I mean, everything was fair game, and it was all just done in the name of comedy. When I tell my kids today, they'll be like, well, wow, that was offensive, Dad. You guys didn't think it was offensive? And I'm like, yeah, we thought it was offensive. That's why we laughed. I mean, offensive can be funny. You don't do it in the real world. You don't take it out of context. You leave it where it is, and it lives on the comedy stage. And they were awesome at it.
I remember it wasn't Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that he did on SNL. It was Mr.
Robinson.
Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. That's right. He was the broke kid on Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, or he was Mr. Robinson.
He was Mr.
If I come to
Robinson.
think of it. And then he was Mr. Robinson. And then he sang the song. He did it just like Mr. Rogers. It was amazing. Or the gold suit that he was wearing when he was trying to play James Brown. He did an excellent James Brown. James Brown going into a bathtub, I think he was. I think he had on a gold like spandex. And speaking of, I'm a fan myself again, as you're talking about gold spandex with Eddie Murphy on the screen. So, yeah.
And his movies took a journey. They moved. He went from being the irreverent comic, right, doing the inappropriate, maybe offensive jokes, but he went all the way through to like Dr. Dolittle. I mean, the movies that he made where he played every character. Family, wholesome movies that we watch with our kids today. He really moved his career where it needed to be moved to do what he needed to do to entertain as many people as possible.
And you bring up a really good point, John, because not many actors can go from having the F-bomb just released so many times in one minute segment of a comedy special to going and crossing over to being every kid's fantasy about Dr. Dolittle and his characters.
Was that the movie? Am I remembering it right? Was it Dr. Dolittle? Why do I feel that might not be right?
No, it's right. Dr. Dolittle, Nutty Professor. He did a
Nutty
couple
Professor.
of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Nutty
Flubber?
Professor.
Did he do Flubber? The Flubber movie? Was that the Nutty Professor with the little green? Was he in that?
I don't know. I'd have to look that one up.
Yeah.
Whether he was or not, these were absolutely all. We remember that he could be because these were the types of family-friendly comedies that he started doing. Daddy Daycare, I think, was another one that was Adam Sandler-esque. You know, Adam Sandler may have been in that. I'm not sure, but even if he wasn't, it was one of those types of movies that was feel-good, funny, had a heart. I just love the way his career moved all the way through. And I bet you money that if he decides to go on tour tomorrow and do Raw Part 2, he could still do that as well as he ever did.
He would kill it. And that's, Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. Actually, Mr. Rogers was at the SNL studio and met with Eddie Murphy and told him how much he loved it. He thought it was hilarious. And so, they talk about Eddie Murphy's a little concerned, like, what is he going to think about this? But he actually embraced the parody, which I think is no surprise, knowing what we know about Mr. Rogers, that he would embrace something like that and find the humor in it. And he had a good time with it. And you're right about him moving along in his career. Robin Williams, it's funny, another stand-up comedian who did something similar. I mean, if you go back and you watch some of Robin Williams' early stuff, particularly, at the Met, brilliant stuff. But, he could get pretty raunchy as well. And then he, there he ends up getting Good Morning Vietnam and Mrs. Doubtfire family movie, Dead Poet Society. His career moved along as well, on and on and on. And so it's interesting to see how some of these comedians that were so brilliant on stage, and we don't see many of them anymore. There's very few, Chappelle and a couple others that could entertain you for 2 hours straight and fill an arena. They were filling arenas.
Steve Martin is another one. Steve Martin, during that same time that Eddie Murphy was doing it in the late 70s into the early 80s, Steve Martin's early stand-up was, he does this parody bit where he has unnatural relations with a girlfriend's cat. And I don't mean that as a euphemism. It was her cat. And it was raunchy. And then he becomes father of the bride. Yeah. They did what they needed to do to reach the audience. And as the audience shifted, they were geniuses in knowing what they had to do to shift along with it. And I don't consider that selling out. I don't consider that falling short. They just were geniuses of meeting society where we were at the time.
Yeah.
I think today I could think of Kevin, like you said, Chappelle, but also Kevin Hart. Kevin Hart would be another one that, he could get on stage and be as raunchy as he wants to be, and then go and do a Jumanji movie and be funny about it for the family.
Yeah. And perhaps the person who's done it best wasn't even a comedian, he was a musician. And that's Ice Cube. I mean, you want to talk about a journey.
Oh yeah.
He just does Disney movies. He does Disney movies now.
Yeah.
But going back to Eddie Murphy, there was a 10-year period there where I just want to list some of the movies that he did in 10 years. And you can include Delirious and Raw because they were filmed as movies as well. But you had Delirious, Raw, Beverly Hills Cop, 48 Hours, Trading Places, The Golden Child, Coming to America, Harlem Nights, and Boomerang, all within a 10-year period. And all fantastic movies. I mean, there's not a bad movie in all of those. And that was one thing, as he got into more movies, we could have discussions about ones that weren't so good, ones that were better. But there was that moment there where it felt like everything he did was perfect.
I remember The Golden Child and Coming to America. The Golden Child, I think, was something that everybody should see. It was a really good little movie, but I don't know that a lot of people. It's not as famous as some of the movies. It was really good.
Yeah, I know of it.
My friends and I would say, never saw it.
Mm-mm.
That's a good one.
Yeah, my friends and I always used to say, I want the knife." That was like something we always said from Golden Child.
Mm-hmm.
Harlem Nights, I think, was absolutely hilarious. Like, just the humor in that was the writing in that. That was just that movie hit me hard as far as just being funny from beginning to end.
And speaking of funny, he actually won the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor in 2015, which is a pretty incredible feat because that's an award that everybody, comedians really strive for. I mean, there's a lot of awards out there, and I think some of them are that entertainers would tell you, yeah, okay, whatever. But that Mark Twain American Humor Award. And because Beverly Hills Cop 4 is coming out here shortly with Eddie Murphy as Axel Foley and Surge, Bronson Pinchot returning as Surge, and all the people who are still alive, of course, returning to do their characters. Sly Stallone was actually cast as Axel Foley, and he quit a few weeks before, and then Eddie Murphy ended up being Axel Foley. And I had heard about this in Sly's documentary on Netflix, Sly. He talked a little bit about that and how he just, once he realized initially the script was a lot more, it was darker. And then they started switching it to comedy. And at the time, Stallone wanted to do something darker. He didn't want to do the comedy. And he went on to do Cobra, which was much darker and grittier than Beverly Hills Cop, which was light and fun.
It'll be really interesting to see when Beverly Hills Cop 4 comes out. If I'm sure all of us Xers, all those of us of a certain generation will run out to see it. It'll be interesting to see how much acclaim it gets, how much attention it gets from the younger generations. I don't know that they know what Beverly Hills Cop is. If I ask my 20-year-old specifically, she will not have seen it. She'll know who Eddie Murphy is, but she'll remember him from The Nutty Professor, not from Beverly Hills Cop.
Well, guess what you're going to see in your Netflix algorithm in the next couple of months? The original Beverly Hills Cop.
I'm sure.
Guaranteed it's going to be all over the place.
Yeah, there's no better trailer.
Hoping that exactly that happens, that the younger generations pick it up because they know Eddie Murphy and they go back and they watch it. And he also did a duet, believe it or not, with Michael Jackson. What's Up With You? And it's been ranked as one of the worst music videos of all time. Think about that. Eddie Murphy and Michael Jackson, two of the most iconic performers that we have ever had, and you could argue in world history, and will ever be. Will always, I mean, hundreds of years from now, when they name the top 100 entertainers of all time, I'm imagining Michael Jackson and Eddie Murphy will both be in that top 100. And here they are doing a music video everybody said was one of the worst of all time.
Party All the Time was pretty bad too. It was fun, but it wasn't good. My girls wants to party all the time, party all the time, party. And he said party. We all heard and mocked potty, Potty. My girl
That's
wants
right,
to
we did.
party all the time. And I got to stop singing.
You know what? Weird Al should have done that. I can't believe he didn't. That was a missed opportunity.
And we all heard it though, right? It wasn't just me.
Yeah.
I remember kids making fun of that.
But then there was the song Axel Foley. Who sang that from the movie? What was the band that did the Axel Foley song?
Well, Axel F was Harold Faltermeyer.
Yeah,
And
the
so that was like
instrumental was the big one. I don't remember what they sang, but the instrumental, Axel F,
Yeah.
that was the big,
Huge.
like, everywhere.
Yeah. And the fact that it was instrumental, like there weren't that many songs out at that time that were instrumental, and yet you knew the beat to that entire song.
Mhm.
Yep.
Axel F, not Axel Foley, Axel F.
There's
Axel
like
F.
3 that I remember, like 70s, 80s, 90s, like 3 70s and 80s instrumental songs that hit the pop charts. One was, I remember Music Box Dancer when I was a little kid in the 70s, complete instrumental, but then, do you remember that one? If you hear it.
Would you do it again so that we
Sure.
can?
Come on, it's
Yeah.
I'm gonna edit this out, so I really don't care.
You're not allowed to edit that out.
What's that?
You can't edit that out. You
I
need to
can do
leave it.
anything I want.
Anything I want.
Here, hold on.
Oh yeah. I always thought, okay, I thought that was an Elton John song.
Okay.
Anyway,
I mean-
so there was Music Box Dancer, there was Axel F, and there was Chariots of Fire. Those are like the 3 instrumentals
Yes.
that hit the charts and did phenomenally well. And if you rank them, I bet you they're the top 3.
And Miami Vice.
Yeah, 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh.
John pulled that up really quickly, Chris. Did you notice that?
I did.
Almost as quickly. It was like he had it on his "Wind Beneath My Wings" playlist.
Yeah.
Dude, I will own Music Box Dancer. It is a beautiful little tinky song. It's like the link, tink, tink, tink. I like it.
I just
I
see you in your room doing this.
Without a doubt. Dude, I have no shame. You're not going to shame me on this one. It's pretty.
We're going to come full circle here, though, John, because just like 80 stars that decided that they were going to go into a music career, social media stars shouldn't go into singing music box dancer.
Well,
careers.
so that's your opinion, and you're entitled to it.
Speaking of music.
Speaking of what?
Speaking of music.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Speaking of music, not Tiny Dancers or what was it? Tiny Dancer? No, that
Well,
was
that's Elton John. Now you're
That's
going to
yeah.
Elton John.
the Tony Danza, Tiny Dancer.
Hold me closer, Tony Danza.
Yeah, hold me closer, Tony Danza.
Yeah.
The soundtrack for Beverly Hills Cop as well. So yeah, New Attitude, Patti LaBelle. Let's see, Neutron Dance, the
Mhm.
Pointer Sisters.
Pointer Sisters.
Yeah.
The Heat is On, Glenn Fry again with Glenn Fry Smuggler's Blues with Miami Vice. Danny Elfman, if you don't know that name, I've mentioned it before. He was the lead singer for Oingo Boingo and then went on to do, to I think, win Academy Awards, at least be nominated for soundtracks. He had a song on there as well. Patti LaBelle Stir It Up was another one on there. So, and then the Axel F. So there was some top 5 hits on that soundtrack. And again, I always go back to the 80s soundtracks and how many people and musicians wanted to be on them. I want to mention, because we talked about family-friendly movies with Eddie Murphy and Dr. Dolittle. And did you know, there it is, there's the did you know again, that he actually has a fear of live animals.
No way.
Yes.
Dead ones are okay.
I guess so.
Most people would have said he has a fear of animals. The fact that you quantified that, I found to be strange.
That's what it said. I'm just repeating what it said. Live animals. I guess because he had to be around them for Dr. Dolittle. What else on Eddie Murphy from your perspective? Because for me, again, like I think about him as we've had a lot of influential comedians and a lot of great comedians, but whenever you see a top 5 comedians of all time, even when you include, even if you go as far back as Lenny Bruce, and we're talking stand-up comedians, not, just comedy in general. But, think about Lenny Bruce and George Carlin and Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy and Robin
Dude, you can go
Williams or
back as
Dave
far as you
Chappelle.
want. You can go back to Red Skelton. And that's why when you said you can go back
Yeah.
as far as, and then you went to the 60s, that's why I chuckled. Because I think some of
Oh,
our
well.
older listeners be like, oh, no, go all the way to Lenny Bruce. You can go way back. But for me, if you say, off the top of your head, name 3 comedians, Eddie Murphy's, anybody that was born from 1970 to maybe 1990, if you say name 3 comedians, Eddie Murphy's on every single one of their lists. The other 2 might change. Some will say Richard Pryor. Some will go with somebody a little bit more current. But Eddie Murphy will live in that top 3.
I'm a huge, as I mentioned, I'm a huge Eddie Murphy fan. I will not turn off one of his movies if it comes. Okay, I shouldn't say that. His family-friendly stuff for me personally, because I don't have kids, hasn't excited me as much. But if
Come
I
on,
see,
there's a moment. Hercules, Hercules, Hercules.
oh, okay, yes.
I mean, it was family friendly, but the man played 7 different characters. He was at that scene at the table. I'm so glad you said something that triggered that, because that scene at the table, whether you have kids or you don't have kids, whether you're 8 or you're 80, that scene at the dinner table where he is all those different characters sitting around, that was amazing. That is an incredible moment in movie history.
Valid point. Like he's just supremely talented. So maybe I should check myself a little bit and go back and watch those again. And Shrek, by the way, voiceover, but you know,
Yeah.
I mean, I love Shrek. Okay, so I'll say there's one that I love, but that was a voiceover.
The donkey. They always called him Donkey. And then when he fell in love with the dragon, he was iconic as that voice.
Yeah, and then I talk a lot about some of the movies and we mentioned a lot of his movies, but Trading Places is one that I think it's overlooked. And I would tell anybody out there that if you're a big Eddie Murphy fan, if you enjoy 80s comedies, and you haven't seen Trading Places, Eddie Murphy, Dan Aykroyd, Jamie Lee Curtis. I mean, that's all I should really have to say for you to go check out the movie, those 3 in the same movie.
Mm-hmm.
I know the movie. I've seen scenes in the movie. It's an incredible movie. It's well written. I know enough of it that I think I've done a video on how it's one of those movies that could not be remade today. It just, there was too much in it that wouldn't work today. Better or worse, that's the world we live in. I've not seen it beginning to end. That's one I've got to go back and look at.
You should. It's fantastic. They're all 3 of them deliver brilliant performances, and then on top of that, Randolph and Mortimer, the brothers who set the whole Trading Places thing up, they're not good guys. And if you've ever seen Coming to America, there's a little Easter egg in Coming to America where you see these 2 old homeless guys that he drops some money to. That's Randolph and Mortimer from Trading Places. So that was kind of cool too, where they had that connection in Coming to America.
It's been a long time since I've seen that movie. Either one of them, actually, quite frankly.
Do yourself a favor. Trading Places. It's good, and it's got a really good message too. I mean, for all the things that, like John said, probably wouldn't play today, it does have a really important message that was a little ahead of its time, I think. So, God, just sounded like Joe Pesci and Lethal Weapon. Okay. Leo gets.
Okay.
Leo gets. Leo gets it, right? Leo gets it. So we talked about Don Johnson and Eddie Murphy, and we talked about Eddie Murphy and Saturday Night Live. So this is a good transition into our next guy, because he had an iconic skit on Saturday Night Live with Chris Farley, and that is Patrick Swayze. Go ahead, fan yourself, Shell.
No, I'm doing the Chris Farley right now.
Oh,
On the but no, wait a minute. When he was the Playgirl with the little bow, there wasn't a woman in TV land not swooning over Patrick Swayze and his incredible dancer's body. That's what we'll call it. It's just wanted to grab his pecs. Sorry, I'm having a moment.
We're gonna have to take a break. Oh, okay. So do you want to take this section and talk about Patrick Swayze, Shell? You can just take it over. You can take it over if you want, because I can't do the whole
I
grabbing
think
pecs.
talking is pretty far down the list of things that she's thinking about when it comes to what would have happened between her and Patrick Swayze.
Patrick Swayze was a girl's fantasy from the time he was. I think Dirty Dancing did it for a lot of us because all we could imagine was grinding with Patrick Swayze. He was just an amazing dancer, amazing actor. He had that beautiful longish hair. There was nothing about him that wouldn't make a girl swoon. So of all the three, though, he was the most swooniest. I'm going to use that as a new word. Swooniest guy out there.
Now, my guess would be that although, yeah, Dirty Dancing, I get it. I think women fell in love with him during Ghost. I think every girl I knew imagined herself making that clay pot with his arms around her and the Righteous Brothers song playing up behind them. And the fact that he was the penultimate perfect husband. Boy, I mean, there was I think it was a Seinfeld episode that established the difference of guys going all the way versus girls going all the way. And Jerry was teaching George the difference that for guys going all the way is going all the way. For girls, it was once George had gotten engaged and showed that he was able to be committed, he could show women that now he's worthy of going all the way. Patrick Swayze went all the way in Ghost. And women romanticize this good-looking, good husband, good person. That's when I would guess women fell in love with him.
Was Ghost, what years were these? Because in my brain, I was thinking Dirty Dancing had been out longer, but I guess it was Ghost then. And
no,
Demi Moore,
I think,
don't know.
I think Ghost was 90.
Yeah.
I don't actually know the years.
Ghost came after Dirty Dancing because when he was not the initial selection for Ghost because he had been kind of known besides Dirty Dancing as an action guy. He had done Red Dawn. Roadhouse had just recently come out. And so I can't remember the whole story behind it, but Next of Kin he had done as well. And so
he had done Outsiders.
The Outsiders. He wasn't known. Youngblood, Uncommon Valor was another one that he was in. So he had this perception that he was this action guy. And so initially he wasn't the one that they were going to select for that.
Dirty Dancing was 87, Ghost was 90. And I guess to take my analogy further, I think Dirty Dancing is where you started to date Patrick Swayze. Ghost is when you fell in love with him and wanted to marry him.
Speak for yourself, John. I think you are, right? John is speaking for himself at this moment.
It was one of those actors that girls wanted him and guys wanted to be him.
Yeah, yeah, 100%, 100%.
Patrick Swayze was the epitome of the tough guy who knew how to be sensitive, hold a woman's heart and her body in his hands. I'm sorry. Give me a minute again. Okay.
And we can't talk about Patrick Swayze, okay, and being this masculine guy that you mentioned, this every girl wanted him, every guy wanted to be him, but so secure in who he was that he was able to be a drag queen in the movie To Wong Fu with Wesley Snipes and John Leguizamo, which was a movie, it was a hit. It had a very difficult time getting made. If Spielberg didn't get involved, if certain Robin Williams got involved and helped push that movie through, but it got turned down left and right initially, and then big names got involved and Patrick Swayze, and it got made, and it was really cool to see someone like Patrick Swayze and Wesley Snipes, who, to Chris's point, action stars and romance stars, and look, they can even have a little bit of fun and do something like this. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
And they made very beautiful drag queens too. They did. I loved it. Well, it's all in how you look at it, but I thought that I forgot all about that one.
Patrick Swayze's pretty no matter how you slice it, but Wesley Snipes, I'm not sure he made such a beautiful woman.
So we talked about, John, you said that, how guys wanted to be him, and it was true, and that this whole idea of like him being this tough guy and this romantic was a real thing in his real life too. When he was, he married his high school sweetheart. He was a great high school football player until he hurt his knee. He started a carpentry business with his wife. They did very well, became very successful until he actually hit it big. And on top of that, he was on a Disney ice show because he went to ballet school. His mom had a dance school. So this person that we saw on screen was actually a big part of his life as well. He had this really healthy balance of kind of like we talk about like the kind of strong alpha male and then the romantic and putting all that together in his real life as well. On top of the fact, get ready for this one, that he was referenced. I couldn't believe this. He was referenced in over 300 hip hop songs, including one by Biggie. I didn't know that, but apparently it was a thing to reference Patrick Swayze in hip hop songs at one point.
By name?
Now that I think about it, there are songs that say Swayze, and I can't. They're not coming right to the top of my brain, but I do recall that.
Because I think, and again, somebody can fact check me on this, but the term Swayze also meant to like kind of lean a little bit, like leaning and lean in, and that was something that people were in the early 90s, mid 90s, that was a thing. And so he was referenced in, I think, over 300 hip hop songs. It's pretty cool.
Huh.
You know, it's funny. I talked about how women fell in love with him during Ghost. I think for me and for guys, the moment we were like, God, this guy's so cool, would be Roadhouse. The speech that he gives in Roadhouse when he's telling people you're nice until it's time not to be nice was like a Fight Club level moment in terms of replaying it once we got to school, you know, as kids. We're like, that was one of those moments that entered into our pop culture, entered into the way we hung out with our friends. We'd be at a bar and someone's doing something stupid, and, you know, the cool head in the room, whichever one of my friends was the one that didn't, he said, hey, take it easy. We're going to be nice until it's time not to be nice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what he said. I have 3 simple rules. 1, never underestimate your opponent. Expect the unexpected. 2, take it outside. Never start anything inside the bar unless it's absolutely necessary. And 3, be nice. Yeah, that's a great scene. And you're right. I am as big a fan as Patrick Swayze as there is. As I've mentioned, my dog Bodie is named after his character in Point Break, which is not an 80s movie, but I would argue that it's one of the greatest action movies of all time. It is a perfect action movie with Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze, and directed by Catherine Bigelow, who went on to do Hurt Locker. So yeah, I love it. I know by John's face he doesn't, but I actually love Point Break. And you get a little Anthony Kiedis in there from Red Hot Chili Peppers as well, which is pretty cool. I
just
also
didn't
want to
like
mention
Keanu Reeves in the movie. I didn't like Tank Girl, whatever her name was, Lori
Petty.
Yeah. What's that? Yeah, Lori Petty annoys me. I like Patrick Swayze. The others in the movie I didn't care for.
You didn't like Utah?
Nope.
Oh man.
I didn't buy him as an FBI agent, surfer boy. He got on my nerves.
I watched the movie. I loved it at the time, but it doesn't go down in my brain as one of those iconic Patrick Swayze things.
It is.
Yeah. Roadhouse, I think, is.
So for those listening, leave in the comments if what you're think about.
You're gonna put that up against like Die Hard, and you're gonna say
it was
Point
the
Break
greatest.
was.
I'm saying it was one of the greatest.
If the list is 2,000 long, then yes, it's one of the greatest 2,000 action movies in the history of time.
It's a top 10.
It's not a top 10.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the comments below, who agrees with me? Who agrees with John?
I can easily come up with 9 movies that are a better action movie than Point Break. That's all I want you to admit.
No, I'm gonna stick to my guns. Top 10. Let's see what everybody says in the comments below.
Okay.
So I did want to mention something else because for whatever reason, this subject has come up a couple of times with us. The colognes in the 80s and the scents, I should say, in the 80s that they approached him about
the fragrance.
Thank you, fragrance. That's a better word. They approached Patrick Swayze about having a fragrance named Patrick, and he turned it down. That apparently he turned down almost $10 million worth of different types of merchandising because he just thought it was nonsense.
Listen, if they'd made a Patrick Swayze fragrance, I might have bathed in it.
So Patrick Swayze, obviously, again, had a great run beyond the 80s, but really in the 80s was it was a huge moment for him and for all of us because we all embraced him and we lost him way too young. And that was really sad when that happened. It was really, really sad to see because I think as a guy, like I looked at his characters as invincible. He was one of those guys that just jumped off the screen, and I thought, this guy's going to live forever. Like nothing will ever hurt him. And the reality is they are just roles and characters. And then there's the human being. But I absolutely, as I mentioned, I love Patrick Swayze. I've always been a huge fan. Never saw Dirty Dancing, as I've mentioned before. I know I'm probably losing a lot of points out there. But
Listen, you're losing
So for
points
those
because
for those that have started siding with Chris in our battle of action movies, before you write down that you're siding with him, this is a man who didn't watch Dirty Dancing. He believes that baby belongs in a corner. Is this really someone you want to vote with? So just saying that, before you take his side, he hated baby.
I put baby in the corner and I left her there. And
All right.
it was my senior prom theme, as I've said on an episode before. It was my
The
senior prom
hate
theme.
mail is coming. The hate mail is coming, Chris.
I had to hear it like 150 times that night. That I had the time of my life was seared into my brain. I can't. I have night terrors about that song.
Call Carmen. Call Carmen. Call Wimberly. He just canceled himself. We need to come up with another person for this. Before we move on, the only other thing I wanted to say, and you just touched on it, Chris, the man left the stage with class. Though he didn't, it wasn't a Matthew Perry type death where we lost him, woke up one morning and found he was gone. It was a longer goodbye for those of us. I remember his interviews on like 2020. And I mean, when I say he left with class, he knew what was happening. Him and his wife were together all the way through to the end. The good times, the bad, really held up this image of what it is to be a man. And it all the way through. And I know that sounds misogynistic, and I don't mean it to be, but the guy was tough right down to the last second. So he still was those characters. He still was invincible in terms of his spirit all the way to the end. And that was the best role he played, was himself all the way through to the end.
in every good actor, their own character shows through, which is why he was so good at being both an action, manly man and also being that loving, tender husband and heart. He had that heart, and in the end, when we did see him fading away, you definitely saw his heart, and you saw his fight too, and you saw every little bit of it.
So in kind of wrapping up Patrick Swayze, and you know, you wrapped it up on a little bit of a serious note, which is important too, because I can tell you that I lost my stepmom to pancreatic cancer as well. And it's for him, you said he's a fighter, and you know, obviously who knows what kind of treatments he had access to, but he did survive, I think 10 or 11 months, which is a really long time. Pancreatic cancer for my stepmom was 3 weeks, and it happens that quickly for a lot of people as well. So again, I don't know the treatments he had access to, but that fighting spirit that he had in him, in his characters, to John's point, seemed to be in his real spirit as well. So pretty awesome. So let's get back on track with some lighter stuff like we always do. And as we move into what the connection is between these three, we've talked about Don Johnson, Eddie Murphy, Patrick Swayze, all of whom make Shell swoon. If you're watching the YouTube channel, you'll see it live and in action. So of those three guys, all amazing entertainers and performers. When we think about the 80s, the history of 80s pop culture cannot be written without referencing those three. So what do these three have in common?
I feel like John knows this. I feel like he's got this grin on his face that says, I know this. And he already wrote something down. I want to think that there's some movie that I wasn't aware of, or something that I can't connect between them that puts them together. But right now, my brain isn't letting me put that movie in front of me. Movie, television show, or the fact that the singers, the fact that they had songs, that would be where I would go with this.
That's where I went with it just immediately, is that they're all one-hit wonders. Party All the Time, She's Like the Wind, Heartbeat, I think was the Heartburn. What was Don Johnson's? But, you know, that's a connection. I don't know if that's the one Chris is coming up with, but they were three great examples of celebrities of their era dipping their toe into the music world. And Eddie Murphy was pretty serious about it, and so was Patrick Swayze. I mean, it wasn't just a side thing to see if I could make a little extra money. Eddie Murphy actually really enjoyed the music side of the entertainment business, and Patrick Swayze was a pretty serious singer and writer of music, and She's Like the Wind, Party All the Time, definitely both hit the top the charts at that time.
I also thought about the fact that Chris said about, Patrick Swayze was definitely known as a dancer. And then you talked about Don Johnson being an athlete and such. And a lot of athletes actually take ballet. So I thought maybe there's a strange ballet connection. Maybe Eddie Murphy did ballet as well. I don't know.
For those of you that are watching on YouTube, Shell, you get 3/4 of a point. John, you get a full point because you got the connection that they all had songs on the Billboard chart. In fact, they all had top 20 songs. So She's Like the Wind went to number 3. Party All the Time went to number 2. And Heartbeat, believe it or not, went to number 5.
Wow.
So all 3 of them had top 10, actually, Billboard chart songs. And to John's point, that was something that happened in the 80s a lot. There were a lot of 80s actors and actresses that dabbled in music.
And some should have and some shouldn't have. But even, Bruce Willis's, we make fun of his and we make fun of, but there was still talent there. And I've said before, it was really tough to be a celebrity in the 60s, 70s, and 80s without being a true triple threat. Because movies would force you to act, sing, and dance, especially earlier on. The big Hollywood productions, if you couldn't do all 3, you had no business being on the silver screen. You might be able to make it on the small screen, not on the big screen. And that still played through into the 80s. And today, I'd be willing to bet we've got some pretty good actors that can command a huge box office and not be able to sing a note. That didn't used to be the case. You needed more talent than just that to get there.
Yeah, and today I think we would all have the question of, is it the actor or actress? Is it their talent, or is it auto-tune? And that wasn't something that was available. Yes, they could go in the studio and enhance their voice and make it a little better, but even if the song was bad, there still had to be some talent there. You couldn't mask it. Unfortunately, I'm making it my mission this year with Milli Vanilli. We saw what happened to them. They lip sync to the song, but that happens all the time today. In fact, auto-tune just got a Grammy, the technology, in 2023. And so I'm making a mission in 2024 to Milli Vanilli to get their Grammy back. But
I disagree with you, Chris. It wasn't even them. I get that you're making the comparison saying that we're enhancing voices to a ridiculous degree right now, but I will just play devil's advocate and say that's different than taking credit for somebody else's work entirely. Milli Vanilli weren't the voices on those tracks. It wasn't them enhanced. It wasn't them at all.
Well, okay, so I would challenge you with this. I would say go get auto-tune and sing a song into auto-tune, and you tell me if it sounds like you.
No, I get it. I totally get what you're saying. Yeah. I totally get what you're saying. But to me, it's at least with auto-tune, you're not stealing somebody else's for work. Somebody wasn't credited for their talent.
So those, by the way, the people who sang those songs were paid as well. And they knew that somebody else was going to perform them. And there are plenty of pop singers that are out there making a lot of money right now who have never sang a song live, ever. They're great performers.
And never could.
They're entertainers. Yeah.
Dude, it's not even just now. If you heard Madonna live, I would argue, versus studio, her voice, she's had some rough on, live moments, but she's an amazing performer. It didn't matter. So I get it. I totally get it. Just like Shell once said in one episode, there's a reason it's the 3 View Mirror podcast, because there's 3 views.
And we should have 3 views. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there were other ones
but
as well.
I'm curious.
Cheryl Ladd.
You were at the beginning of the podcast, you were so sure that we wouldn't get this one. Did you think the songs were more obscure than they were? Do you just, first of all, the fact that it was you bringing it to us was a huge clue, because we know how you are when it comes to music and soundtracks. So you kind of give it away just by virtue of who we know you to be. But, at least the last 2, those songs were boom right there. As soon as I hear Patrick Swayze, I think a few things, one of which is She's Like the Wind. As soon as I hear Eddie Murphy, She Wants to Party All the Time.
Yeah, I thought Don Johnson's one wasn't as front and center, I guess, as the other two. And, it's okay. Like, I think it's good that you guys got it. I think these are three, like I said, awesome entertainers that you can't write the history of 80s pop culture without mentioning. And so it's fun to talk about all three. But it was a different time when,
I will
when
say,
we had, they were all taking.
you've got a better poker face than Shell, because I tested the waters and I brought up the fact that they sang during the actual episodes, during the actual segments of the podcast, and you didn't get. I was like looking to see if there would be any kind of change in your face or whatever that would give it away, and you didn't.
We talk a lot about one-hit wonders when it comes to the 80s and music, and I think today with and I'm not going to categorize and generalize and say all of them, because there are crossovers. I mean, Lady Gaga is doing a great job crossing over when we talk about Lady Gaga music and movies, and Justin Timberlake has done a great job with that as well. Mos Def, if you know hip hop, Mos Def is a great actor as well as a great rapper. So there is crossover. I don't know that how much it's actually happening, and I think we have a lot of one-hit wonders today when it comes to I can do this. I'm a good actor. I'm a good musician. We had a lot of people in the 80s who were good at a lot of different things. And they, as John said, trained in a lot of different things because they were looking for an opportunity to break in, and they weren't sure which one of those things were actually going to do it for them. So maybe the lead-in was comedy for Eddie Murphy. The lead-in might have been dancing for Patrick Swayze, and it was potentially modeling for Don Johnson. But ultimately, they ended up doing all of these different things once they got there. And they showed that they had a lot of different talents. And that may be, again, another kind of cool connection to some of the 80s and maybe a little bit of the 90s people, is that they had the ability to showcase a lot of different talents. Whereas today, maybe there's a lot of people who are just kind of this one thing that they do. And that's okay, by the way. If you do it really well,
but it
great.
plays itself out over and over again. Look at names like Jennifer Lopez, who became this huge dramatic talent, but she was a fly girl on In Living Color. So dancing was her way in.
But you like you said, they weren't sure what was going to bust them into the industry or what role they were going to get first. They had to be buff. They had to be talented. They didn't know if they'd have to play piano during the movie. And with such stiff competition, then somebody else, well, I'm sorry, there's a piano scene. This one can play and you can't. You're out, So I see it.
So just in closing, it's awesome that both of you got it. I think, again, this may have been an easier connection than some of the other ones that we've done, but it gave us the opportunity to talk about three icons of 80s pop culture that you cannot write the history of 80s pop culture without. And Don Johnson, Eddie Murphy, and Patrick Swayze. And I hope all of you had a great time talking about all three of these. And maybe tonight or over the weekend or next week, you'll go watch some of their movies or listen to their music.
And this was a wonderful connection, Chris. And I absolutely loved it, because we also want our audience, because I enjoyed talking about it, we also want our audience to be able to make these connections as well. And I hope that over the course of time, our audience is also keeping score with maybe 2 out of 6 or 7, however many podcasts we've had now.
And that's about as good a way as I can think of to end it. This is John Catrides signing off and saying, guys, we will hopefully see you next week.
And this is Rochelle O'Black.
And this is Chris Clues. Stay rad, everybody.